It was a quiet night in the city, and Rookie Officer James Harris was doing his routine patrol. As a young cop, he felt the weight of his badge every time he stepped into his patrol car. This was his first real chance to prove himself, and he was determined to do things by the book. He drove slowly through the empty streets, listening to the soft hum of the radio as he kept his eyes on the road. It was peaceful, but James knew that even on quiet nights, anything could happen. As he turned onto a new street, something caught his eye. A sleek black car, moving just a little too fast for the empty streets. James immediately flicked on his lights and turned on the siren. His heart raced a little. This was his chance to show that he was capable of handling the job. He had been waiting for this moment since he first joined the force. The car slowed down and pulled over, the tires making a soft screech against the pavement as it stopped. James parked behind it and got out of his car, trying to keep his nerves under control. He walked up to the driver's side, where the window was already rolling down. As he approached, he noticed the man in the car was dressed in a sharp suit, his eyes calm and confident. "Good evening, sir. I'm Officer Harris. I pulled you over for speeding. Can I see your driver's license and registration?" James asked, trying to sound as professional as possible. He had seen this interaction countless times in training, and now it was his turn to handle it for real. The man in the car nodded quietly and handed over his license and registration. James glanced at the documents, scanning them for the usual details. The name on the driver's license read, Chief Anthony Brooks. It didn't click immediately in James's mind, but something about the name seemed important. He looked up at the man in the driver's seat, noticing how calm and composed he was. He had seen many drivers get nervous when pulled over, but this man didn't seem fazed at all. "Thank you, sir. I'll be right back with your ticket," James said, stepping back to his car. As he walked away, something felt off. It wasn't until he sat back in his patrol car and glanced at the name again that it clicked. Chief Anthony Brooks. The Chief of Police. James's mind went blank for a moment as he processed the realization. He quickly glanced at the license plate and confirmed it. The car wasn't just a regular car. It was the chief's personal vehicle. He had accidentally pulled over the chief of police. James froze, his hands gripping the steering wheel. His heart started pounding. This was a moment no rookie cop could ever prepare for. He had just stopped one of the most important figures in the department. The chief of police, the very person James admired and respected for his leadership in the force. Panicking slightly, James quickly grabbed the radio and considered calling it in, but then he stopped. What was he supposed to say? "I just pulled over the chief of police, and now I have to give him a ticket." He took a deep breath, knowing he had to face the situation. There was no going back now. James took a deep breath and slowly got out of his patrol car, trying to calm the nervous butterflies in his stomach. The lights on his police car were still flashing brightly in the dark, casting a blue glow across the empty street. He had already made a mistake by pulling over the chief of police. Now he had to figure out what to do next. As he walked back to the black car, he reminded himself to stay calm. His training had prepared him for tough situations, but this was different. The man sitting in the car wasn't just another driver. He was someone important, the chief of police, the very person James had admired since he first decided to become a cop. When James reached the driver's side window, he could see the chief sitting perfectly still, his hands resting on the steering wheel. The chief's face was calm, but there was a small glint of amusement in his eyes. James couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed, his cheeks flushing red as he stood there. "Good evening again, sir. I'm really sorry for the inconvenience," James said, trying to sound confident even though his heart was racing. "I just need to confirm your license and registration." The chief nodded without saying anything, his face still relaxed. James glanced at the documents again, even though he had already seen them. Chief Anthony Brooks, it read, but James couldn't stop himself from staring at the name. This was the chief of police, the most powerful person in the entire department, and James had just pulled him over. The chief of police was well known in the city. He had been with the department for many years, and his leadership skills had earned him respect from everyone in law enforcement. But even though James had heard so much about him, he had never expected to meet him like this. He felt awkward and a little out of place. "Sir, I think there's been a mistake," James said, his voice shaking a little. "You're the chief, aren't you?" The chief looked at him with a raised eyebrow, clearly not surprised. "Yes, I am, but it seems like you've mistaken me for someone else," he said in a calm voice, his tone friendly but firm. James stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say. He had never been in a situation like this before. What was he supposed to do now? He didn't want to make things worse, but he also didn't want to embarrass himself further. "I didn't mean to pull you over, sir," James said, his voice filled with nervousness. "I just thought you were speeding. I didn't know it was you." The chief nodded again, his face showing no sign of anger or frustration. Instead, he gave James a small, understanding smile. "Mistakes happen. You're just doing your job, right?" James blinked, feeling both relieved and confused. The chief wasn't angry or upset. In fact, he seemed almost understanding. This wasn't what James had expected. He had expected to be yelled at or criticized, but the chief just seemed calm, even kind. "Just make sure you're paying attention to the details next time," the chief added with a chuckle. "And remember, we all make mistakes sometimes." James nodded, feeling a bit lighter. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. He wanted to apologize again, but wasn't sure what to say. The chief of police was still sitting there, waiting for him to make his next move. What would happen next? James stood there for a moment, trying to collect his thoughts. His heart was still beating fast, and his palms felt clammy. He had just made the biggest mistake of his career. Not only had he pulled over a car for speeding, but that car had been driven by the chief of police, the very person who was supposed to lead and guide the department. The chief sat calmly in the car, waiting for James to respond. His hands were relaxed on the steering wheel, his expression neutral, but there was something about the way he was looking at James that made him feel like he was being tested. James knew he had to say something, but what? "How do you apologize to the chief of police for pulling him over?" "I'm sorry, sir," James said, his voice shaking slightly. "I didn't realize it was you. I thought I was just pulling over a regular driver who was speeding. I really didn't mean to bother you." The chief nodded slowly, showing no signs of anger. In fact, he seemed more understanding than James expected. "I know you didn't mean any harm, Officer Harris," he said calmly. "You were just doing your job." James blinked, surprised by the chief's calmness. He had expected to be reprimanded, maybe even sent home for making such a big mistake. But the chief wasn't angry at all. Instead, he seemed almost understanding. "I understand this is a tough job," the chief continued, "and sometimes we have to make quick decisions. But you also need to be aware of the people you're stopping. You never know who they might be, and that's something you'll learn with time." James nodded, still feeling embarrassed. The situation was awkward, and he wasn't sure how to handle it. He had never been in a position like this before, and he had no idea what the next step was. Should he just let the chief go, or should he follow through with the ticket? What would happen if he let him go? Would it look like James didn't take his job seriously? "Is there anything else I can do, sir?" James asked, his voice unsure. The chief paused for a moment before responding, his gaze softening. "You've done enough, officer. Just be more careful next time. The last thing I want is for you to get into trouble over a simple mistake." James let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The chief wasn't going to punish him. In fact, it almost felt like he was trying to teach him something. James could feel a sense of relief wash over him, but at the same time, he also felt like he had learned something important. "I'll be more careful, sir. Thank you for understanding," James said, his voice steadying. The chief smiled, giving James a small nod. Good. Now, go ahead and take care of your duties. I'm sure we'll see each other around. James stood there for a moment, still trying to process the situation. As he turned back toward his patrol car, he felt a sense of pride mixed with embarrassment. He had made a mistake, but he had also learned something valuable from the chief of police. It wasn't about making mistakes. It was about how you handled them. As he watched the chief's car drive away, James couldn't help but feel that this encounter would stay with him forever. He had learned a lot in just a few minutes, and he knew he would never forget this moment. James stood still for a moment, watching the chief of police drive away into the quiet night. He had expected the chief to be upset or angry, but instead, the chief had been calm, understanding, and even kind. James couldn't quite wrap his head around it. After all, he had just made a rookie mistake by pulling over the most important person in the department. As he sat back in his patrol car, James couldn't help but replay the interaction in his mind. His first instinct had been to feel embarrassed, to panic at the thought of having upset someone so high-ranking. But instead of getting angry, the chief had treated him like he was still learning. Like everyone makes mistakes, even the most experienced officers. It was a humbling experience for James, one that he knew he would not forget. After a few moments of sitting in his car and thinking things over, James grabbed his radio and called in his location to the dispatcher. His hand still felt a little shaky, but the fear had started to subside. The chief's words echoed in his mind. Mistakes happen. You're just doing your job. James understood what the chief meant. He had been so focused on trying to do everything right, to prove himself in his new job, that he hadn't considered how quickly things could go wrong. It was easy to get caught up in the moment, to let nerves take control. But now, he realized, it wasn't about never making mistakes. It was about how you handled them and learned from them. That was what mattered. As James continued his patrol, he reflected on the chief's response. He had expected to be scolded, maybe even sent home for making such a big error. But the chief had chosen to teach him instead. He had shown James that a mistake didn't define who you were as an officer. It was how you grew from it that mattered. The more James thought about it, the more he realized how lucky he was to have experienced this encounter. Not every rookie cop had the chance to learn from the top officer in the department. The chief could have easily dismissed the situation or given James a hard time, but instead, he had taken the time to explain and even comfort him. It was clear to James that the chief wasn't just a leader. He was also a mentor, someone who cared about the people he worked with and wanted to see them succeed. As James cruised through the streets, he began to feel a renewed sense of confidence. He had learned something valuable that night, something that would stay with him throughout his career. The encounter with the chief wasn't just a mistake. It had become a lesson in humility, growth, and leadership. James couldn't wait to meet the chief again. But next time, he hoped it would be under better circumstances. Until then, he was determined to be more mindful, more aware, and ready to learn from every experience. The chief had set an example for him, and he would carry that example with him in the days and years to come. For the first time since he'd become a cop, James felt like he was on the right path. He wasn't just a rookie anymore. He was someone who could handle mistakes and grow from them. And that was the kind of officer he wanted to be. The next morning, James woke up early, his mind still focused on the events from the previous night. He had replayed the entire situation over and over in his head, each time realizing something new. The encounter with the chief of police had been more than just an embarrassing mistake. It had been a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. As James made his way to the station, he thought about the chief's calmness. Instead of reprimanding him or making him feel like a failure, the chief had treated him with respect and understanding. That was something James hadn't expected. In the past, he had heard stories of high-ranking officers who would have taken advantage of a situation like this to show their power. But not the chief. The chief had been a role model, not just a leader. James had always admired the chief from a distance. He was a man who had earned respect through years of hard work and dedication. The chief was known for his fairness, his ability to lead with integrity, and his commitment to making the department a better place. But James had never seen the chief up close, not like this. He had always viewed the chief as someone who was above everyone else, someone who never made mistakes. Now, James realized how wrong he had been. The chief wasn't perfect, but he was a man who understood the value of learning from mistakes, both his own and others. The more James thought about it, the more he realized how important that lesson was. Everyone made mistakes. It didn't matter how experienced you were. What mattered was how you handled those mistakes and what you learned from them. As James arrived at the station and parked his car, he felt a wave of determination wash over him. He knew he still had a lot to learn, but now he felt ready to take on whatever challenges came his way. The chief had taught him that it wasn't about being perfect. It was about growing, improving, and learning from every experience. That was the true measure of a good officer. When James entered the station, he was greeted by a few of his fellow officers. They asked him how his night had gone, and he smiled, trying to play it off. He didn't want to dwell on the mistake. But as the day went on, he found himself thinking about it more and more, reflecting on how he had handled the situation. Later that afternoon, James was assigned to work alongside another senior officer. As they went over their patrol plan for the evening, the senior officer asked James about his first few days on the job. James shared a few stories, but he couldn't stop thinking about the chief. The senior officer noticed his distraction. "What's on your mind, Harris?" he asked with a raised eyebrow. James paused for a moment before speaking. "I was just thinking about something the chief said to me last night," he replied. "He said that mistakes happen, and it's how we learn from them that counts. I guess I didn't realize how true that was until I made one myself." The senior officer nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, the chief has a way of putting things in perspective. He's been around long enough to know that nobody's perfect. But the key is to keep moving forward, learning and growing." James smiled, feeling more confident than he had in days. "I think I'm starting to understand that now." As the day went on, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had learned something important the night before, something that would stay with him throughout his career. He wasn't just a rookie anymore. He was an officer who had learned the value of humility, responsibility, and the importance of learning from mistakes. And with that realization, James felt ready for whatever the future held. The days following his encounter with the chief of police felt like a turning point for James. It wasn't just about the job anymore. It was about understanding the bigger picture, the human side of law enforcement. The chief had taught him a lesson that no classroom or training session could have ever provided. It wasn't just about making arrests or following procedures. It was about dealing with people who made mistakes, just like everyone else. As James drove through the quiet streets on his next patrol, he found himself thinking more deeply about the words the chief had shared with him. "Mistakes happen," the chief had said. And it was true. No one, no matter how experienced, was free from mistakes. What mattered was what you did after you made that mistake, how you handled it, how you learned and grew. James had always been focused on following the rules perfectly, afraid to make any errors. But after the incident with the chief, he realized that trying to be perfect wasn't the goal. The real goal was to grow, to learn from each situation, and to become better, not just as a police officer, but as a person. The next few weeks passed by quickly. James had a few more encounters with drivers, and though he still felt nervous at times, he was more confident in his approach. He didn't focus so much on avoiding mistakes anymore. Instead, he focused on how to handle them when they came up. One afternoon, during a routine traffic stop, James found himself pulling over a car that was speeding. The driver, a middle-aged man, appeared nervous as he rolled down the window. James could tell the man was worried about getting a ticket. As James asked for the man's license and registration, he realized that he was calm, much calmer than he had been before. The nervousness that had once gripped him during stops wasn't there anymore. He had learned to focus on the situation, not on his fears. He had learned to be patient, just as the chief had shown him. When he returned to the man's car to hand back the documents, James smiled and gave a brief, polite warning about the speeding. "Just slow down next time." "Okay," he said. The man nodded, thanked him, and drove away. It was a small interaction, but for James, it was a big step forward. He had handled it with the calm professionalism he had been striving for. More importantly, he had been able to see the person behind the situation, instead of focusing only on the rules and the ticket. Later that day, James had a moment with one of his colleagues, Officer Stevens. Stevens had been on the force for years and was known for his level-headed approach to every situation. He noticed the change in James and asked him about it. "You've been looking a lot more confident lately," Stevens said, leaning against the car. "What's different?" James thought for a moment before answering. "I think I'm starting to understand what the chief meant. It's not about being perfect. It's about handling things when they don't go as planned and learning from them." Stevens nodded, clearly approving of James's new mindset. "That's the key. None of us are perfect, but we can always improve if we're willing to learn." James smiled, grateful for the support. It felt good to know that he was on the right path. The chief's lesson had stayed with him, and now it was becoming a part of who he was as an officer. As he finished his shift and headed home that evening, James felt a sense of pride. He had made mistakes, yes, but he had learned from them, and with each new day, he was getting better at handling the challenges that came his way. A week had passed since James had pulled over the chief of police, and though the incident was over, it still weighed heavily on his mind. It wasn't just about the mistake he had made. It was about the lessons he had learned from it. The chief had given him a chance to grow, to become a better officer, and James didn't take that lightly. One afternoon, James was sitting in the break room of the station when he saw the chief walk in. He had seen the chief around the station before, but this time felt different. There was a moment where their eyes met, and James couldn't help but feel that this was his chance to properly thank him. Taking a deep breath, James stood up. "Chief Brooks," he said, his voice steady but with a hint of nervousness. The chief turned and smiled, a warm, friendly expression on his face. "Officer Harris," he greeted him with a nod. "How are you doing?" "I'm doing better, sir," James replied. He paused, unsure of how to continue. He had practiced what he wanted to say in his head many times, but now that the moment had come, it was harder than he thought. "I wanted to thank you," James said finally, looking the chief in the eye, "for your understanding the other night. I was so nervous, and I made a big mistake, but you didn't get angry. You didn't punish me. Instead, you helped me see something important. I've been thinking about it ever since." The chief raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by James's words. "I'm glad to hear that, Harris. It's not every day that someone takes the time to reflect on what happened. It takes maturity to do that." James felt a wave of relief wash over him, but there was still something he needed to say. He had been carrying the weight of his mistake with him, and it was time to let it go. "I know I messed up," James continued, his voice soft but sincere. "But I promise I'm going to be more careful in the future. I won't make that mistake again. And I'll make sure I do my job with respect. Respect for the people I'm stopping and respect for the people I work with." The chief smiled, his expression thoughtful. "That's all anyone can ask for. You're still learning, Harris, and that's okay. The important thing is that you're learning and growing." James nodded, feeling both grateful and humbled by the chief's words. It wasn't just about doing his job well. It was about the person he was becoming through his experiences. The chief had taught him that every mistake was an opportunity to become better, not just in his career, but as a human being. "I'm really sorry for the mistake, Chief," James said again, his tone more serious now. "I just wanted you to know how much I appreciate your guidance. It means a lot." The chief placed a hand on James's shoulder, offering a reassuring smile. "You don't need to apologize, Harris. You're a good officer. Just keep learning, keep improving, and you'll do just fine." For a moment, James stood there, feeling the weight of the chief's words. He had learned so much from the past week, from the mistake, from the chief's patience, and from the advice he had received. It was more than just about the job. It was about being the best version of himself, not just for the department, but for the people he served. As he walked out of the break room, James felt a new sense of purpose. He wasn't perfect, but he was getting better. And with the lessons he had learned, he knew he could face whatever came next. Over the next few weeks, James noticed something changing in himself. He had always been focused on following the rules, making sure everything was done by the book. But now, after his experience with the chief, he began to see things differently. It wasn't just about doing his job perfectly. It was about doing his job with understanding, compassion, and patience. Every shift became an opportunity to practice what he had learned. He found himself approaching situations with a calmness he hadn't felt before. When he pulled someone over for a minor traffic violation, he no longer saw them as just a driver who had broken the law. Instead, he saw them as a person who might be having a rough day, who might be nervous or worried. And he approached them with a sense of empathy. One evening, during a routine traffic stop, James pulled over a young woman who had been speeding. She was in a hurry and looked anxious when he approached her window. Normally, James would have felt a bit of pressure to get the stop over with quickly, but this time he paused and took a deep breath. He smiled at her, trying to ease her nerves. "Good evening, ma'am," he said in a friendly tone. "I noticed you were speeding. Can I see your license and registration?" The young woman looked up at him, her eyes wide with worry. "I'm really sorry, officer," she said, her voice shaky. "I'm just trying to get home to my sick mother. She's in the hospital, and I was trying to get there as fast as I could." James could see the genuine concern in her eyes, and for a moment, he remembered how it felt to be in a stressful situation. He took a moment to think about what the chief had taught him, to approach people with understanding. "I understand, Mom," James said, his tone softer now. "I'm sorry to hear about your mother. Just please be careful, all right? I don't want you to get hurt. Make sure you're driving safely, especially when you're in a hurry." The young woman nodded, clearly relieved. "Thank you, officer. I really appreciate it." James handed her back her documents and gave her a warning rather than a ticket. She thanked him again and drove off, her anxiety replaced with gratitude. As James watched her car disappear down the street, he felt a sense of pride. He had done his job, but more importantly, he had done it in a way that was kind and understanding. He had helped someone, rather than just giving them a ticket. That night, as James sat in his patrol car, he thought about how much he had changed since that night with the chief. It wasn't just about following the rules anymore. It was about being present, being mindful of the people he interacted with. Every stop, every encounter was an opportunity to make a difference, not just through enforcement, but through compassion. James realized that the chief had given him more than just a lesson about mistakes. He had shown him how to be a better person and a better officer. It wasn't enough to just do the job. He had to do it with respect for others and a willingness to understand their stories. As he finished his shift and headed home, James felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. He had learned something that would stay with him throughout his career, something that would guide him as he faced whatever challenges lay ahead. He wasn't just an officer now. He was someone who knew how to listen, how to care, and how to make a real difference in the lives of those he encountered. Over the next few weeks, James noticed something changing in himself. He had always been focused on following the rules, making sure everything was done by the book. But now, after his experience with the chief, he began to see things differently. It wasn't just about doing his job perfectly. It was about doing his job with understanding, compassion, and patience. Every shift became an opportunity to practice what he had learned. He found himself approaching situations with a calmness he hadn't felt before. When he pulled someone over for a minor traffic violation, he no longer saw them as just a driver who had broken the law. Instead, he saw them as a person who might be having a rough day, who might be nervous or worried, and he approached them with a sense of empathy. One evening, during a routine traffic stop, James pulled over a young woman who had been speeding. She was in a hurry and looked anxious when he approached her window. Normally, James would have felt a bit of pressure to get the stop over with quickly, but this time he paused and took a deep breath. He smiled at her, trying to ease her nerves. "Good evening, ma'am," he said in a friendly tone. "I noticed you were speeding. Can I see your license and registration?" The young woman looked up at him, her eyes wide with worry. "I'm really sorry, officer," she said, her voice shaky. "I'm just trying to get home to my sick mother. She's in the hospital, and I was trying to get there as fast as I could." James could see the genuine concern in her eyes, and for a moment, he remembered how it felt to be in a stressful situation. He took a moment to think about what the chief had taught him, to approach people with understanding. "I understand, Mom," James said, his tone softer now. "I'm sorry to hear about your mother. Just please be careful, all right? I don't want you to get hurt. Make sure you're driving safely, especially when you're in a hurry." The young woman nodded, clearly relieved. "Thank you, officer. I really appreciate it." James handed her back her documents and gave her a warning rather than a ticket. She thanked him again and drove off, her anxiety replaced with gratitude. As James watched her car disappear down the street, he felt a sense of pride. He had done his job, but more importantly, he had done it in a way that was kind and understanding. He had helped someone, rather than just giving them a ticket. That night, as James sat in his patrol car, he thought about how much he had changed since that night with the chief. It wasn't just about following the rules anymore. It was about being present, being mindful of the people he interacted with. Every stop, every encounter was an opportunity to make a difference, not just through enforcement, but through compassion. James realized that the chief had given him more than just a lesson about mistakes. He had shown him how to be a better person and a better officer. It wasn't enough to just do the job. He had to do it with respect for others and a willingness to understand their stories. As he finished his shift and headed home, James felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. He had learned something that would stay with him throughout his career, something that would guide him as he faced whatever challenges lay ahead. He wasn't just an officer now. He was someone who knew how to listen, how to care, and how to make a real difference in the lives of those he encountered.